I came home 3 nights early. I didn't tell anyone, not my wife, not my daughter, not the neighbors who waved as I turned onto our street like nothing was wrong. I was supposed to be finishing a job out of state, counting down the last few days before a quiet return. Instead, I stood in my driveway just after midnight, engine cooling, breath fogging the windshield. The house was dark. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know. I stepped out into the cold. The air bit harder than I expected, sharp enough to wake every nerve. Somewhere behind the house I heard a sound that didn't belong to night. Not an animal, not wind. A child's voice, low, controlled, repeating something. I moved quietly along the side of the house, boots sinking into frost-hardened grass. The backyard lights were off, but moonlight spilled across the yard in thin silver patches. Near the far fence, I saw movement. My daughter stood barefoot on the frozen ground. She was wearing only a thin sweater. No coat, no socks. Her arms were crossed tight against her chest, but she wasn't crying. She wasn't shivering the way a child should in that cold. She was speaking. "I understand," she said softly. "I will listen next time." My heart slammed so hard it hurt. A shadow moved beside her. An adult woman stepped forward, wrapped in a heavy coat, boots planted firmly in the snow-stiff earth. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't yelling. Her voice was calm, instructive. "That's good," the woman said. "Say it again." "I understand," my daughter repeated. "I will listen next time." I started forward before my brain caught up, but something stopped me. My wife stood a few steps away, watching, not intervening, not arguing, observing. Her posture was relaxed, hands tucked into her sleeves, face unreadable. This wasn't chaos, this was routine. The woman near my daughter nodded with approval. "Discomfort helps memory," she said. "Fear confuses it. We avoid fear." My daughter nodded too, like this was a lesson she'd practiced. I stepped out of the shadows then. My foot crunched against ice, loud in the silence. My daughter turned first. Her eyes widened, not in panic, but in something closer to relief mixed with worry. "Daddy," she said carefully. My wife turned more slowly. "You're home early," she said. I crossed the yard in seconds and scooped my daughter up. Her skin was ice cold. She didn't resist. She didn't cling either. She just tucked her face into my shoulder and went quiet. "What is this?" I demanded. The other woman didn't flinch. She looked at me like I was late to a meeting. "She broke a rule," she said. "This is correction." My wife stepped closer. "It's not what it looks like," she said. I stared at her. "She's standing barefoot in freezing weather. She needs to learn consequences," my wife replied. "It builds resilience." I looked down at my daughter. "Who taught you this?" I asked gently. She hesitated. Then she said, "Grandma says listening keeps everyone safe." I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the night air. I carried my daughter inside without another word. My wife followed. The other woman did not. She remained in the yard, watching the house like this wasn't over. Inside, my daughter wrapped herself in a blanket without being told. She sat straight on the couch, hands folded, eyes forward, too controlled. I knelt in front of her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head once. "I didn't cry," she said quickly. I remembered. That was when I understood. This wasn't punishment. It was training. And whatever I had walked into had been happening long before I came home early. Some things don't announce themselves as danger. They teach children to accept it quietly. I didn't sleep that night. My daughter did. Curled under 3 blankets on the couch, breathing slow and steady like her body finally believed the cold was over. I sat on the floor beside her until the sky began to lighten, watching for any sign that she'd wake up scared. She didn't. That scared me more than if she had. My wife stayed in the bedroom. She didn't come out. Didn't ask if our daughter was all right. Didn't apologize. The house felt divided by more than walls. Like something had snapped clean through the middle. When morning came, the woman from the yard was gone, but her presence wasn't. It lingered in the way my daughter sat at the table, back straight, hands folded, waiting to be addressed. It lingered in the way she asked permission to sip her juice, in the way she flinched when the heater kicked on too loudly. I made breakfast slowly, deliberately, narrating nothing, just watching. Did you know I was coming home early? I asked my wife finally. She shook her head. No. Then why wasn't she inside? She made a choice, my wife said. Choices have consequences. I stared at her. I'd known this woman for years, traveled with her, trusted her with my life, with our child. I didn't recognize the calm certainty in her voice now. It wasn't anger. It wasn't cruelty. It was conviction. Who taught you this? I asked. She hesitated, just long enough. My mother, she said. She helped me when I was young, when things were unstable. The word hung there unfinished. She believes children need structure, my wife continued. Clear rules, clear outcomes, no confusion. That's not structure, I said. That's exposure. She wasn't in danger. She was barefoot in freezing weather. And she complied, my wife replied. That matters. I pushed my chair back. My hands were shaking now, and I didn't bother hiding it. How long has this been happening? My wife looked down at her plate. A few months. A few months. My daughter was 7. That meant a significant portion of her memory was now shaped by standing outside at night, repeating phrases until adults were satisfied. I knelt beside my daughter's chair. Can you tell me what the rules are? She looked at my wife first. Tell him, my wife said. My daughter swallowed. I have to listen the first time, she said. I have to keep my body calm. I have to accept consequences without crying. And if you cry? I asked. She paused. Then the lesson lasts longer. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not discipline. Conditioning. I carried her to her room and told her to play. Not quietly. Not carefully. Just play. When I came back, my wife was standing by the window. You can't undermine this, she said. Consistency is important. What happens if I don't agree? I asked. She turned to face me. Then you don't understand what's at stake. What's at stake? I said flatly. She needs to be strong, my wife replied. The world isn't gentle. Neither was my childhood. I heard it then. Not justification, projection. You're repeating something, I said. She stiffened. I survived. So did many people, I replied. That doesn't make it right. The rest of the day passed in a brittle silence. My daughter stayed close to me, not touching, just near. Like proximity itself was reassurance enough. That evening, after she was asleep, I went outside. The yard looked ordinary in daylight. Grass, fence. The patch of ground where she had stood barefoot looked no different from anywhere else. But I stood there for a long time anyway, because whatever had been happening wasn't an accident. It was a system, and systems don't disappear just because you interrupt them once. They adapt. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach tighten, that this wasn't over just because I was home now. The next morning, my wife told me her mother was coming back that evening. She said it casually, like she was announcing a grocery run or a change in dinner plans. No warning, no negotiation. Just information delivered with the confidence of someone who assumed agreement. I felt my jaw tighten. She's not welcome here, I said. My wife didn't look surprised. You're emotional right now. That word again. Emotional. As if what I'd seen in the backyard was a misunderstanding brought on by jet lag. I'm protective, I said. There's a difference. She knows what she's doing, my wife replied. She helped raise me. She understands discipline in a way most people are too soft to accept. I looked toward the hallway where my daughter's bedroom door was half open. Your mother teaches obedience through fear. She teaches control, my wife said. Fear is what happens when children don't understand why rules exist. I stopped arguing then. Not because I agreed, but because I realized logic wasn't what was being tested here. Loyalty was. The grandmother arrived just before sunset. Her car pulled into the driveway with practiced ease, tires crunching on gravel like this was still her territory. She stepped out wearing the same heavy coat as the night before, posture straight, movements economical. She smiled when she saw me. Home early, she said. Not a question. I stood between her and the door. You're not staying. She didn't raise her voice, didn't bristle. She simply looked past me toward the house, toward my daughter. She needs consistency, she said. Interruptions confuse children. She's not a project, I replied. She's a child who needs to learn how the world works, she said calmly. Pain teaches faster than words. My wife stood beside her now, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. That was when I understood this wasn't about one woman's ideas. It was an alliance. Dinner was tense but quiet. My daughter ate carefully, eyes flicking between adults, gauging the temperature of the room the way someone learns to gauge weather after enough storms. Afterward, the grandmother asked to speak with me alone. We stepped outside onto the back porch. The air was colder than earlier in the day. Not as brutal as the night before, but sharp enough to sting. She is intelligent, the grandmother said, strong-willed. Children like that require correction early. Correction doesn't involve freezing them, I said. She wasn't freezing. She replied. She was uncomfortable. There's a difference. I stared at her. You planned that. Yes. And you'd do it again. She didn't hesitate. If necessary. Inside the house, I could see my wife moving around the kitchen. My daughter sat at the table, hands folded, waiting. I felt something shift then. Something heavy settling into place. This stops, I said. Tonight. The grandmother's smile thinned. You don't understand the consequences. I understand them perfectly, I replied, and you're not staying. She studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Very well, she said, but understand this. She leaned closer. When you remove structure, children don't become free, they become lost. She turned and walked to her car. My wife didn't speak to me after that. Not that night, not the next morning. She moved through the house like a visitor, distant and careful, and my daughter watched everything. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she whispered something that made my blood run cold. Daddy, she said, am I in trouble for telling you? I sat there long after she fell asleep, because whatever else was happening in this house, my daughter had learned one thing very clearly, that silence was safer than honesty. And that was a lesson I could not allow to take root. The next day, I called in favors I hadn't touched in years, not because I wanted to escalate things, but because instinct told me I was already late. Systems like the one I'd walked into didn't form overnight, and they didn't dissolve just because one person objected. I took my daughter to school myself, not because my wife asked, because I needed her out of the house. She held my hand tightly the entire walk, not frightened, alert. That hurt in a way I didn't have language for. After I dropped her off, I didn't go home. I went to the local records office. It wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, just paperwork, public filings, community programs. The kind of quiet infrastructure that hides behind words like guidance and enrichment. I searched for my mother-in-law's name. What came up wasn't criminal. That was the problem. Workshops, retreats, parenting seminars hosted in borrowed spaces, no official licensing required, no oversight beyond attendance forms and glowing testimonials written in careful, identical language. Resilience through exposure, emotional discipline, structured consequence learning. I recognized the phrasing. I drove home slower than necessary. When I walked in, my wife was packing a bag. Not hurried, not panicked, intentional. She's invited us to stay with her for a few weeks, she said, to reset. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. You're not taking her. She needs stability, my wife replied. You're disrupting that. I'm protecting her. My wife finally looked angry then. You're undermining everything I survived to build. That sentence unlocked something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. This wasn't about our daughter learning strength. It was about my wife proving that what happened to her hadn't been abuse. If she could pass it on and call it discipline, then it became justified. You don't get to rewrite your childhood using her, I said quietly. My wife's face hardened. You don't get to decide what recovery looks like. That evening, I packed my daughter's bag instead. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten. I just acted. When my wife realized what I was doing, she stood in the doorway, blocking the hall. You leave with her, she said, and you'll regret it. I looked at her. Really looked. The woman I loved was still there, buried, guarded, terrified. But the mother standing in front of me had chosen allegiance over protection. I already regret staying silent, I said. I won't add to it. I took my daughter and went to a friend's house, someone I trusted, someone who asked questions and didn't rush me when I couldn't answer all of them yet. That night, my daughter slept curled against my side, breathing deep and heavy. No rehearsed phrases, no folded hands, just sleep. And as I watched her, I understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't a disagreement to be mediated. It was a line, and once crossed, it demanded consequences just as structured as any lesson they claimed to teach. The difference was mine would not require a child to suffer in order to learn. The call came the next morning. My wife's voice was calm. Too calm. "You can't keep her from me," she said. "That's kidnapping." I took a breath before answering. "It's protection." "You don't have proof," she replied. "And you know how this looks." She was right about that much. A father who came home early, a disagreement about parenting, a child moved out of the home without consent. On paper, it could be framed a dozen different ways, but paper doesn't show patterns. I spent that day documenting everything. Dates, times, phrases my daughter repeated, the rules she had memorized, the way she asked permission to exist. I wrote it all down while it was still sharp, before anyone could tell me I was exaggerating. I spoke to a child therapist recommended by my friend, not to diagnose, to listen. After an hour, the therapist leaned back and said something that settled deep into my bones. "This isn't discipline," she said. "It's compliance conditioning." That phrase mattered, because compliance conditioning doesn't need bruises. It doesn't leave marks that photograph well. It teaches children to override instinct in favor of authority. That evening, my daughter asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. "Am I bad?" she said. "Or just learning?" I knelt in front of her and held her face gently. "You are good," I said, "and no one gets to teach you pain to prove it." She nodded like she understood, like she wanted to believe me. The custody paperwork followed quickly after that. Not dramatic, not loud, just legal machinery grinding into motion. Temporary arrangements, supervised visitation, court dates set weeks away. My wife didn't fight them the way I expected. She reframed. She told everyone I was unstable, that I'd changed after coming home, that my past work made me rigid, paranoid, that I didn't understand her methods because I hadn't lived her childhood. Some people believed her. Some didn't. The grandmother didn't reach out directly again. She didn't have to. Her influence moved through channels I was only beginning to see. Support groups, letters, statements framed as concern. It would have been easier if they were cruel. They weren't. They were convinced. And conviction is harder to dismantle than malice. The night before our first hearing, my daughter crawled into bed beside me and whispered something that sealed everything. "I don't miss them," she said. "I miss being quiet." That was the cost. Not bruises. Silence. I held her until she slept, staring at the ceiling, knowing what the next day would bring. I wasn't afraid of losing arguments. I was afraid of a system that mistook obedience for wellness, and I was prepared finally to speak loudly enough to disrupt it. Because once you see how control hides behind calm voices and reasonable words, you can't unsee it, and you can't step back from it without becoming complicit. Whatever happened next would change all of our lives, but at least this time my daughter wouldn't be standing alone in the cold to learn it. The hearing was quiet. No raised voices, no theatrics. Just people in clean rooms asking careful questions and taking notes while lives hung in the balance. My wife sat across from me, posture perfect, hands folded the way our daughter used to fold hers. She spoke clearly, rationally, about structure, about resilience, about the importance of consistency. Her mother wasn't there. That absence spoke louder than anything else. When it was my turn, I didn't argue philosophy. I didn't attack intentions. I described behaviors. The rules my daughter memorized, the phrases she repeated, the way she learned that silence shortened punishment, the way cold became a teacher and fear became a tool. I read from my notes, not looking up, letting the details do their work. The therapist testified next. Calm, measured, precise. She explained how compliance conditioning works, how children trained to suppress distress often appear well-behaved, how obedience is frequently mistaken for emotional health, how damage hides in plain sight when adults agree not to look too closely. The room felt different after that, not accusatory, sober. The judge didn't rule that day, but orders were put in place, immediate ones, protective ones. My daughter came home with me. Supervised visitation was granted, no unsupervised contact with the grandmother, mandatory counseling, review dates scheduled. It wasn't victory, it was interruption. The weeks that followed were slow and uneven. My daughter laughed more, spontaneously, loudly. She cried sometimes too. Real cries, messy ones, the kind that end without instruction. We worked with the therapist regularly. I learned how often I had mistaken calm for comfort, how easily I had praised stillness instead of joy. My wife and I spoke less, not out of anger, out of distance. She told me once during a supervised visit, I only wanted her to be strong. I believed her, and I told her the truth in return. Strength isn't what you learn when you're afraid, I said. It's what you build when someone stands with you. She didn't argue after that. The grandmother never contacted me again. Her programs continued elsewhere under new names with new families who hadn't yet learned to listen for what was missing beneath the words. I reported what I could, shared what I knew. It wasn't enough to stop everything, but it was enough to stop it here. At home, my daughter still asks permission sometimes, then catches herself and smiles. I forgot, she'll say. I tell her it's okay, because forgetting fear is part of healing. Coming home early saved my child, not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I was willing to interrupt something that looked calm, reasonable, and deeply wrong. Some lessons aren't taught with rules, they're taught with presence. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.